welcome, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for joining Network 2020 for our discussion today about whether NATO has found its 21st century purpose. My name is Courtney Dogger, and I'm the president of Network 2020. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you today and also to welcome our panelists and moderator for what is, I think, sure to be a very interesting and timely discussion. As background for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, Network 2020, we're an inclusive international community, and we're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy community. We run a number of events like these that are educational in nature, webinars. We also do deep dives. We run foreign affairs discussion groups. So lots of interesting content. Please do check out our website. And like almost all of our discussions, this one will also be available on our YouTube channel afterwards as well. So please do subscribe. So with that, it is my great honor to introduce today's panelists, starting with Rajan Menon. He is the Ann and Bernard Spitzer Chair in Political Science at the City College of New York and City University of New York. And he's also a senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University, and a global ethics fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. And interestingly enough, he was the very first speaker we had when in person, when I took over at the helm of Network 2020 in, gosh, what was it, 2016. So it's wonderful to have you back. Thank you so much. And next we have Rachel Rizzo, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, which focuses on European security, NATO, and the transatlantic relationship. She's also served as the director of programs at the Truman Center for National Policy and the Truman National Security Project. And last but not least, we have Jamie Shea, and he is the visiting professor of the Strategy and Security Institute, University of Exeter, United Kingdom, and member of the group of strategic advisors of the NATO Special Operations Forces Command at Shea in Belgium. And he had a multi-decade career at NATO, so we're very pleased to have him as well. And I'm very happy to that Joanna Waszczowski will be moderating today's panel. She is a Network 2020 senior advisor and has her PhD in international relations and advises government officials and nonprofits, among others. So welcome, Joanna, welcome panelists. Thank you all for joining us today. And over to you, Joanna.
Thank you so much, Courtney. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has had a seismic impact on Europe and the stability of the rules-based international order. While Vladimir Putin had justified Russia's military intervention by claiming that he was preventing Ukraine from joining NATO, he made a major miscalculation. His actions did not result in a divided response by members of NATO, but rather united the alliance in its determination to punish Russia and to assist Ukraine in its struggle. Will this unity last? What challenges does NATO face? And does the alliance need to evolve in order to meet what it believes is its 21st century purpose? And how will the alliance address relations with Russia in the future, given that Putin could be in power for the next decade and beyond? I look forward to discussing these and other questions with our expert panel today. So let me first begin with a question to both Jamie and Rachel. It would be useful to start the discussion with a very brief history of NATO before the invasion of Ukraine. What have been some major inflection points for the alliance since its founding in 1949? So let me begin with you, Jamie.
Well, Joanna, first of all, good afternoon to you, and many thanks to Network 2020 and Courtney as well, and Brian for the kind invitation to participate today. Truly honoured. Well, NATO was founded in 1949, which means that it's the longest military alliance since the Athenian League against Sparta in the decades before the birth of Christ. So it gives you a sort of sense of perspective. It's only the second military alliance that the United States at that time had concluded in its history. The first, of course, went back to the American War of Independence, directed against my country, quite appropriately at the time, Great Britain. So as you can imagine, with an alliance that's gone on for the best part of 8 decades already, there have been lots of twists and turns. First period that takes us from 1949 right the way through to the end of the Cold War is characterized, of course, by collective defense, the very thing that NATO is now returning to because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The founding father of the alliance was Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, and NATO's purpose was really to establish an effective defense and deterrence and wait for something to happen. It took a long time before that something did happen, as George Kennan in his famous containment doctrine had predicted that it would. 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. NATO went through a very temporary existential crisis because, of course, the adversary, the Soviet Union, its alliance, the Warsaw Pact, all disappeared. NATO was the victim of what some experts called catastrophic success. But the alliance is very adaptable. And one of the reasons I think why its member states did not want to give it up was because, number one, the American security guarantee, which was unique, and a fear that if you sort of sent the Americans back home, they might never come back again, or they would come late to the battle, as in World War I and World War II. So keep that locked in. And secondly, a sense, particularly if you look at Germany, that NATO had sort of collectivized defense. It had taken it away from European countries that hadn't been very good at handling it in their history. And like a collective insurance policy, it made it something that everybody does together. So I think the sort of the weight of tradition kept NATO going. But of course, in the 90s, it had a glorious time because it was able to go on the political offensive with no great adversary blocking it any longer. Those were the years of NATO enlargement, of NATO partnerships. NATO created what one of my German academic friends calls a partnership industry, reaching out to about 45 countries in the world, including Australia, Japan, New Zealand, still there today, to form security partnerships. It enlarged so that today half of its membership has joined since the end of the Cold War. And with Finland and Sweden waiting in the wings, that could be over half very soon. We'll have to wait and see what happens there. It was also a time when NATO discovered that its military instruments, no longer really needed for collective defense, were quite useful in dealing with out-of-area conflicts, notably in the former Yugoslavia, of course, from the mid-1990s onwards. And then that took us to Afghanistan, that took us to Libya, in 2011, to piracy in the Gulf of Aden. Admittedly, as those missions went on, they became, as the farther they went from Europe, the less likely to produce the successes that people had hoped for. And Afghanistan is still something where clearly NATO needs to learn some hard lessons. But nonetheless, for a long time, NATO was more visible doing things outside its treaty area than maybe inside. But of course, in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and sent its troops into Ukraine, into the Donbass, the pendulum swung back even then to putting an emphasis back on collective defense. Not that NATO believed that we would be in the situation with Russia that we're in today, but it clearly showed that Russia was not willing to abide by international law. It clearly brought Russian forces into closer proximity to NATO states. It made the Eastern European allies, given their history, quite. So a lot of what NATO is doing today, very briefly, and only soon, is not necessarily a departure from what NATO has been doing for the last 8 years. It was already going back to collective defense after 2014, already realizing that it couldn't leave a military vacuum on half of its territory in Central and Eastern Europe. NATO membership is not just being part of a club, it also means NATO's collective arrangements to actually be able to defend members. So troops going east to the Baltic states, to Poland, ships going to the Black Sea were already a feature of the NATO scene before Russia invaded Ukraine full scale. But of course, the events since February have been a massive shock for all allies. I spoke of Finland and Sweden. Their approach to NATO is hardly conceivable given their previous non-alignment status without that big shock. And NATO, of course, today faces some tough challenges. Yes, on the one hand, it's brought unity. Fear brings everybody together. We know that that very well. But on the other hand, the prospect of a potential war against Russia, a nuclear war, is not one that many NATO ambassadors would welcome. The financial demands on remilitarization are going to be major. The issue of if you have Finland and Sweden coming in, you double the number of kilometers along the Russian border that you have to start thinking about defending. And of course, you have with Ukraine a difficult decision about how many of your weapons you keep for yourself, for your own defense, on how many of those weapons do you give free to the Ukrainians, because in a way, they are now the first line of defense of NATO itself. So yes, unity, but nothing in life ever comes without a major downside as well.
Thank you so much. That was very, very comprehensive. Rachel, what significant points have you seen with NATO, how it's evolved over time?
Thanks so much, Joanna. And Jamie, that was the most comprehensive history of NATO in 5 minutes that I've ever heard. That was really impressive. I hope to be able to do that one day. But I think there are a couple things here that Jamie sort of mentioned that I'd like to pull on a little bit that sort of highlight where we are today and how we got to where we are today. The first is right after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and how that has affected and laid the groundwork for the US presence in Europe today and the US relationship with European security today. You know, I think there was a real worry after the dissolution of the Soviet Union that NATO's main adversary no longer existed. So what would NATO do going forward? What was its purpose? What was its role in the global political climate? And I think for the United States, there was a real worry that if we allowed the Europeans to really build their own defense capabilities, that might render NATO not necessarily irrelevant, but maybe not as effective as it once was, and in turn may push the United States out of the European continent. So there's been a lot of these discussions over the last couple of decades, actually, about the Europeans needing to spend more on defense, needing to take more responsibility for their own security. But I think it's important to go back to how we got here and how these conversations at NATO have evolved throughout the years. I think it really did start in the early 90s. I think there was also an important moment that everyone is, I think, talking about nowadays regarding NATO enlargement. And there's a really interesting foreign affairs poll that came out today. Rajan, I think you were on it too, about whether or not NATO enlargement after the fall of the Soviet Union was a mistake. So I would encourage everyone to go take a look at that on foreign affairs. But a lot of the discussion today, I think, centers around whether or not Ukraine and Georgia, to a certain extent, should have or will at some point join NATO. Now, we can go into many different rabbit holes, but I think that there was an important moment in 2008 discussing NATO enlargement at the Bucharest summit, where there was a question about whether or not Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join the alliance. And I think we sort of gave them the worst end of the stick, which is there was a promise, sort of a promise that was made that they would eventually join, but there was never really a timeline given. And so these two countries have been sort of in between two worlds for 13 years now, being super close partners of NATO, but not being protected by NATO's Article 5. And at the same time, you know, Russia has used that as part of the reason for its aggression towards both of these countries. I wouldn't say that NATO membership is the main character in this story, but it is a supporting actor, right? That's sort of, I think, the way to look at it. So I think Jamie laid out really important points, but there's just those two items that I might want to add.
Right. Thank you so much. And then if I can turn to you, Rajan, how has Russia viewed this evolution of NATO?
First of all, Joanna, thank you to you and to Courtney and to Brian for inviting me back. You invited me last in 2006, and I was wondering when the phone might ring again, if ever. It's quite clear. The one thing that the critics of NATO and the champions of NATO expansion can agree on is that no leader sitting in Moscow since 1990, when NATO expansion became a possibility, theoretically, liked it. Gorbachev did not, and he tried to stop it in many ways. First, by proposing that NATO and its counterpart, the Warsaw Pact, be liquidated in favor of a security arrangement from the Urals to the Atlantic, Euro-Atlantic security that would include Russia. Thereafter, he proposed a neutral Germany, and failing that, he proposed that NATO not advance into what was then the GDR, what is now Eastern Germany. He even proposed that perhaps the Soviet Union should be a member of NATO. So there's no question that he did not like it, and he has been a critic of it ever since. The documentary evidence about Yeltsin's position is even more overwhelming based on declassified documents that everyone can see. Repeatedly, he told Clinton two things: that NATO expansion would bring to the fore in Russia forces that the US, which professed to care about democratization in East Central Europe and Russia, would not like. And second, that no Russian, no matter his or her leanings, left, right, center, would be quite able to understand why an archetype of the Cold War, NATO, would be moving eastward at the very same time that the West was telling Russia that the Cold War is over, Russia is a democracy, and Russia is a partner. Of course, Yeltsin was too weak to do anything about it, and I might add half the time drunk. Didn't help. Come the 2000s, you have a confluence of factors that change the game. A younger, more vigorous leader in the persona of Vladimir Putin comes to power. Oil prices soar between 2000 and 2008. The Russian army is rebuilt, and as they say in Russian, the power vertical, the central government's authority, is restored. And a pushback comes. I think the key turning point was 2008 at the Bucharest summit, where NATO made the decision to admit Ukraine and Georgia, and thereafter kept waiting for 22 years, a point that's already been referred to. So the point to make is that however much the Ukraine war has to do with Vladimir Putin, and I don't condone it in any way, although I've been a critic of NATO expansion from the day it was a mere glimmer in anyone's eye in Washington, that this is something peculiar to Putin is completely wrong. Ambassador William Burns, now the head of the CIA, wrote a cable in 2008 in which he wrote to the State Department saying, "I have talked to Russians of all stripes, of all sorts, to a man, to a woman. They are opposed to NATO expansion. You should know the depth of the opposition here." So on this, there's absolutely no question. The question of whether NATO should have been expanded, nevertheless, is another issue.
Right. Thank you so much. And then if I can turn to Rachel and Jamie, we've already talked about how NATO's return to its collective defense orientation, but what was it about this crisis in Ukraine that motivated NATO to act so decisively and in unity? And how likely is this determination to last? So if I could start with you, Rachel.
Sure. Well, I first think that the fact that war has returned to the European continent is a shock to anyone, and especially that this isn't the sort of hybrid kind of warfare that we've seen Russia engage on over the last 10, 12, 15 years. This is a more conventional looking war. And I think that for many people, this idea that that would happen on the European continent again, many thought that that wasn't ever going to be the case. And so I think there's a bit of shock there, right? But I think NATO's response to this crisis actually was born out of the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, which has really set NATO up to respond decisively to this invasion. And if you look at NATO's response to 2014, they created Enhanced Forward Presence, which is a set of multinational battalions that are located in the Baltics and Poland. And there's discussions happening right now about adding more of those multinational battalions to countries like Slovakia, Hungary, and potentially others. They created the Rapid Action Plan, which was agreed to at the Wales Summit, which basically launched the most significant reinforcement of NATO's collective defense since the end of the Cold War. It tripled the size of the NATO response force. And so this is all sort of setting the stage, I think, to responding to Russia's increased aggression over the last 5 or 6 years. And so NATO's response and its ability to respond quickly to what has happened is partially because many of the elements that are necessary for a quick response have already been in place since 2014. So the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, for example, which is a 5,000 strong spearhead force of the NATO response force, can deploy, is supposed to be able to deploy anywhere in just a matter of days. And a few weeks after, maybe just a couple weeks after Russia's invasion, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg announced the deployment of elements of the NATO response force for the first time in a collective defense role in NATO's history. So these are all very significant occurrences that have, I think, shown that NATO can respond quickly if necessary. But I think when it comes to the response to Ukraine, it's important to denote between how NATO responds as an alliance and the unity that we've seen and how bilaterally countries are supporting Ukraine. It's much different for NATO, a consensus-based organization, to make a decision with all 30 allies. That's a very different story than it is thinking about how bilateral countries are supporting Ukraine one-on-one, which I think is probably more substantive. So while NATO, I think, has shown unity and solidarity in this crisis, the really meaningful occurrences have happened on a bilateral basis.
Thank you, Rizzo. That's a very important distinction. Thank you. Jamie, so why do you think NATO has been so determined with this particular Russian action in Ukraine?
Well, I have to return the compliment to Rachel this time round, because she has given, I think, a very comprehensive answer, which I would have striven, had you turned to me first, Joanna, to give myself. But you've asked me to say a few things. I'll try to add a few extra points. I think, first of all, Rachel is right. Obviously, the enormity of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was bound to sort of oblige NATO to revise its arrangements for collective defence in Europe. After 2014, NATO played, typical of alliances, a delicate balancing act. On the one hand, wanting to put multinational battalions, as Rachel pointed out, and forces into Central and Eastern Europe to fill that vacuum that I referred to earlier, but without provoking Russia, and frankly, without parking a lot of very expensive forces full-time in Central and Eastern Europe, which might be needed, for example, from a US perspective in the Middle East, from a European perspective in Mali or the Central African Republic, or obviously from an American perspective also in the Indo-Pacific region. So it was an attempt to sort of have a strategy which was based on a thin sort of blue line, a tripwire of NATO forces, which would be multinational and therefore a deterrent, but they wouldn't have a war-fighting capacity. So if Russia did attack, the whole trick would be to get reinforcements across Europe really quickly. This became known as military mobility in the NATO jargon, and NATO set up a command in Norfolk, Virginia, for the Atlantic sea lanes of communication. It set up a reinforcement command, a rear support command at Ulm in Germany, and it conducted several exercises to make sure that, if the call came, it could quickly get those troops back across the Atlantic or from Western Europe into Eastern Europe. But it was always, to my mind, a very risky strategy, because it relied upon good intelligence, early decision-making, the forces being available, nothing going wrong with roads or railways or ports or infrastructure. And I think, what's happened since Putin's invasion of Ukraine last February is NATO has, if you like, given up the fiction that this is a serious strategy and is going back to a more Cold War posture, that the best reinforcements are the guys who are already there, permanently deployed with all of their equipment on the front line, ready to fight and to prevail on day one. Although I noted from testimony that was given a couple of days ago by the Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in Washington, that the United States still is a bit hesitant about this notion of permanent deployment. It would like permanent bases in Central and Eastern Europe, paid for by the Europeans, into and out of which it can rotate its troops. But anyway, first part of the answer, I agree with Rachel, is that given that NATO's foremost task is collective defense, it was inevitable that it would have to up its game and revise its strategy and build up its forces in Central and Eastern Europe, both for deterrence and because deterrence now means war fighting. It means winning wars and no longer simply hoping to prevent them, at least for the time being. Because whatever the outcome of the Ukrainian conflict, given where Russia is today, has also militarily speaking taken over Belarus, whatever the outcome, we're likely to see more sizable numbers of Russian forces parked permanently closer to NATO territory than we had before. But the interesting point is the other part of your question, of course, why help to Ukraine? Well, here I put it all down to leadership. I mean, the funny thing about NATO's history since the end of the Cold War is that although NATO says we only defend ourselves, our mission is only to defend our own member states. You've heard this from Jens Stoltenberg. Only countries that have the Article 5 security guarantee are going to be defended. This isn't true. As I know from my time as NATO official, we intervened on behalf of the Bosnian Muslims. We intervened on behalf of the Kosovar Muslim community in 1999. We intervened on behalf of the Afghans, on behalf of the besieged population of Benghazi in 2011, as part of the, if you like, emerging responsibility to protect doctrine. Now, I'm not going to argue that all of these were particularly successful, and they certainly got us into trouble with the Russians because coming back to what Rajan was saying a moment ago, in my experience of negotiating with the Russians, they were even more upset about some of these interventions by NATO than they were about NATO enlargement at the time. So NATO, in fact, has a kind of habit where the leadership is there, where the mood is right, of intervening on behalf of non-members as well. In the case of Ukraine, the Biden administration, I think, has made all of the difference. Had Biden sort of been Trump and sat on the fence, you have to ask yourself the question, pace Boris Johnson and pace some of the Central and Eastern European leaders, whether within Europe itself, the will, think of Germany, would have been there without the leadership of the United States pulling the coalition together to provide that firm response. So NATO doesn't give itself a mandate. It depends upon, the leadership is there. And if it doesn't come from Washington, it doesn't really come very much from Europe, at least not so far. The second thing is that the enlargement of NATO could have something to do with this, because you've seen the refugees being overwhelmingly welcomed in Poland, in the Baltic states, in Eastern Europe, in Slovakia, even in Hungary. You've seen the bulk of the heavy military equipment, the T-72s, the S-300s being sent by the Czech Republic and Slovakia. You've seen the training taking place in Poland. You've seen that today the Polish Prime Minister offer 10,000 hospital beds to treat wounded Ukrainian soldiers. It's to my mind, the fact that NATO now has all of these Eastern European members who identify overwhelmingly with the Ukrainians has also had something politically, as well as the leadership of the United States, of maybe having a firmer reaction. I agree with Rachel, not by NATO, the organization, although it does help Ukraine in certain areas like cyber defense, for instance, but by the NATO allies. But even if NATO itself is not, if you like, the weapons procurement agency, all of these NATO meetings that have been taking place have served nonetheless to coordinate as a clearinghouse the weapons that are being sent. So to some degree, I think it's all down to political leadership.
Great, thank you so much. And then Rajan, if you could describe, do you think Putin was surprised by NATO's strong response to their action in Ukraine, and how do you think he's going to address opposing that unity? How is he potentially going to try to undermine that unity if he can?
Joanna, if I might just take a slight detour to comment on something that's been raised here. I think it's very important to make a distinction between NATO's out-of-area operations. As Senator Richard Lugar said, if NATO doesn't go out of area, it'll go out of business. So there's Afghanistan and Libya, both of which turned out to be disasters, and then the Balkans. But NATO's commitment to defend in Europe a country applies only in the case of members that are covered by Article 5. So notice that in Ukraine, President Biden has gone as far as he can, but he's made it clear that no Americans will fight in Ukraine. No other member of NATO has volunteered. When the Ukrainians said, we are prepared to entertain neutrality if they're external guarantors, and they had a very high bar that within 3 days, if necessary, there would be armed intervention, not a single member of NATO, despite all of the talk about the violation of international law, has come forward. Article 5 itself is misleading, by the way. If you read the fine print, it is not something that goes on like a flick of a button. It actually gives members much more latitude should they choose to do it. And that's important because not long ago, there was a poll taken in which some NATO members opined that they might not come to the aid of a fellow NATO member if it was attacked. That's another story. Now, how will Putin, has Putin been surprised? Yes, I think this war has been, even if he manages to eke out a military victory, a strategic disaster across the board. But here's what I think he will do. He will have to first make the Russian economy stand up again because of the damage the sanctions have done. He will then, I think, beef up forces on the Swedish and facing Sweden and Finland if they do choose to join. He will bring Belarus more under its shadow, Russia's shadow, and possibly station troops there permanently. For all practical purposes, Belarus has been reduced under Lukashenko to an adjunct of the Soviet Union, and it will certainly station more missiles and nuclear weapons in the Kaliningrad salient. Essentially, this war has amounted to a burning of the bridges between Russia and the United States, and so long as Mr. Putin is in power, I cannot see any movement on the diplomatic front, on the arms control front, on the trade front, because this is a definitive parting of the ways, it seems to me. But to answer your question, was Putin surprised? Yes, I think he's also been surprised by the course of the war. I think he expected a much quicker victory, and he didn't anticipate what has been, by and large, a disastrous performance by the Russian military.
Great, thank you so much. I know we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, so I'd like to turn now to those questions. And the first one, actually, we can go directly back to you, Rajan. What is your take on why U.S. foreign policy community has been so starkly divided as to whether NATO's expansion was a mistake?
Well, I don't think it's been starkly divided. I think the critics of NATO expansion are a distinct minority and remain so. And going forward, there'll be even more of a cry in the wilderness. I think the overwhelming majority of what, I don't like this term, but I'll use it anyway, because it's shorthand, the foreign policy establishment, that is the press, think tanks, academics waiting in think tanks, hoping they'll get into the government, the whole cluster of people have been overwhelmingly in support of NATO expansion. There is a weird codependence between Europe and the United States. The United States would like to be the protector par excellence of Europe because that gives it the stature of world power. You know, part of American primacy comes from being the defender of the last resort for Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Europe. That is to say, all the major centers of power in the world. For the Europeans who have a GDP 7 to 8 times that of Russia, the United States is necessary to defend them because it's a wonderful deal. Why not continue the process? I mean, it just beggars belief that the Europeans don't have the economic resources and the technological capacity to defend themselves. There's all this fretting about power vacuums and who will fill the vacuum in the eastern flank. First and foremost, in my opinion, this should be a European problem. And no one has yet to convince me that the Europeans don't have the wherewithal to fill that vacuum. They don't have the political will. And for that, we are partly to blame.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, Rachel.
I jump in here just really quickly because there's a couple points here that I'd like to pull on a little bit. You know, one of the buzz phrases, I guess, that you hear a lot in the Washington and European policymaking communities over the last few years has been this idea of European strategic autonomy, which is there's no real agreed upon definition for what it actually is. But the long and short of it is that the Europeans, for all of their economic power and military capabilities, should have, at the end of the day, the ability to take care of their own security, both within the continent of Europe and within its own neighborhood. This doesn't mean the desire to act without the United States, but perhaps the ability to, if it comes down to it. And I think that what we're going to see from this crisis are a couple of different camps emerging in the United States policymaking community. I think there's one camp that continue to point the United States in the direction of the Indo-Pacific, and who are saying, look, this invasion of Ukraine can't refocus us back to Europe. We have to continue focusing on the pacing threat, which is China, and the most important geographic location for the United States, which is the Indo-Pacific. And then you sort of have another camp, I think, and have perhaps worked on transatlantic relations for a really long time, who say that we told you so. Russia is a spoiler. They have nuclear weapons. They have the ability to shape US foreign policy in the way that perhaps other countries don't. And so we need to double down in Europe. We need to perhaps send more troops permanently to Europe. I don't think either of these are really right. I think the correct approach is somewhere in the middle, which is, yes, we have to acknowledge the fact that the Indo-Pacific and China should be the strategic focus of the United States. And we need to look at this moment as an opportunity to continue to push the Europeans to spend more, to develop their own capabilities, especially Germany. There is no reason that Germany's moment that it's experiencing right now should be transient. This should be something that continues for them, and they should really take this opportunity to play much more of a role both in Europe and geopolitically. Whether or not that happens, you know, that's a much broader question, but I think these are some of the questions that we should be asking ourselves right now.
Joanna, can I add something very quickly to what has just been said by Rachel? I think it's very important. Some years ago, there was a report by the Parliamentary Commission of the Bundestag by its chairman, Peter Bartels, and it was an inventory of the state of the Bundeswehr. Now, note that the Bundeswehr is the army of the wealthiest country in Europe. It was a scathing analysis, not only of the amount of spending, but of the absence not of heavy equipment, but night vision goggles, body armor, the lack of spare parts that kept submarines and aircraft and ships from operating at ready notice. And if you look at the NATO's latest report on who is where in meeting the benchmarks of the Wales summit, I believe Germany is second last. Now, in Washington and the Washington-Boston corridor, and maybe in parts of the West Coast, this makes sense. But I can assure you that in the American hinterland, people find this rather amusing. And over time, it will become infuriating. So there is now this commitment by the Germans to do more on behalf of their own defense. Perhaps they will, perhaps they won't. My question is, will this be sustained? And will Europe take a bigger role, not just in burden sharing, but in doing more to defend against a problem that is, by virtue of sheer geography, much more important to them than the United States? That doesn't mean the end of the transatlantic alliance. It doesn't mean American isolationism. It doesn't mean that the US will depart from Europe. These are all kind of bogeymen that are put out there to kind of stifle the debate. The debate should be about a much more informed set of options post-Cold War, because whatever Russia may be, it is not the Soviet Union, and nor is there any Warsaw Pact remaining.
Yeah, but could I also
Yes.
come in on this one, if I may, Joanna, because I think it is a fundamental question, and I think I'd like to build on what Rajan just said, because he's right. I mean, last year, the NATO alliance, of course, the US being the principal spender here, but the NATO alliance managed to sort of spend well over $1 trillion on its defence, and this is massively more than what Russia spends, although Russia, of course, is the spoiler, and what China has been spending, even if you account for some of the black budgets of Beijing's defense program. So a lot of money is being spent, and we're going to now see more money being spent because as my fellow panelists know, the Germans have committed to a modernization program of the Bundeswehr to fix some of those problems that Rajan was referring to, 1 billion euros, together with a commitment to meet the 2% of GDP on defense, which is the NATO target. But many other countries, even little Belgium, a country of which I'm now a proud citizen, has agreed to add 1 billion euros to the defense budget. So there's going to be money. And I imagine if you're in the defense industries, you may be salivating at the prospect of all of these contracts. But I think one of the big challenges for NATO, together with the EU, which is also collectively now with its so-called PESCO and European Defence Fund, spending more on defence. One of the big challenges of these two big organisations in Brussels is going to say, look, if we're going to keep our taxpayers' confidence on this, we've got to spend this money wisely. We can't waste it on all of the duplication, on all of the fouled programs that we had to cancel at the last minute. That has characterized procurement in Europe and everywhere over the last couple of decades. We don't necessarily need to match the Russians tank for tank. Why should we be spending on vulnerable aircraft carriers that could easily be taken out by anti-ship missiles? What are the lessons of the Ukrainian conflict in terms of the kind of equipment that allows troops to be mobile, survivable, lethal? Should we look more to cyber? Should we look more to artificial intelligence? What is going to get us not just the best bang for the buck, but the best bang for the euro? And how collectively in NATO and the EU can we organize this in such a way, as I've said, that we don't all sort of duplicate each other's programs for tiny markets, but really do make sure that we spend this money wisely, not just for NATO, but in ways that help us also to ensure our security on the global stage. This is a golden opportunity. And if we, fluff it and waste this money, and defense, believe me, is the easiest social activity where you can waste money very quickly. Billions disappear without a trace. If we fluff it in the alliance, then I think it's going to make it much harder to cry wolf next time and ask for these sort of larger build-up. So it's an opportunity, but NATO has to get in front of it before countries simply start, thinking, oh, we need more ships, we need more aircraft, we need more tanks. Let's, give big contracts. And when this equipment arrives in 10 years' time, we discover that it's already obsolete. So sorry, that was just a coda that I wanted to add to the points made by my two fellow panelists.
Yes, no, thank you so much for that. And then I have a question. I can start with you, Rachel. What are the biggest potential divisions in NATO looking forward? I mean, we've already seen Hungary being a bit more hesitant because of its close relationship with Russia and with Putin. So what do you see moving forward could be some of the stumbling blocks?
Well, of course, the fact that NATO is a consensus-based organization and all 30 allies must agree to major decisions means that one ally can spoil major initiatives, right? And so it's important, I think, for NATO to focus on the fact that there are increasing divisions between some NATO countries and to do everything it can to tamper those down. The major worry for me, I think, is, when it comes to what NATO is, right? It's a military alliance at the heart of it, but I think it's much more than that. And this is an argument that I think some people would grapple with, but it's also an alliance that defends democratic values, right? And so when it comes to NATO's Article 5 and its mutual defense, when countries start to disagree on what is worth defending and what they are defending, then I think you have cracks and fissures start to come to the surface, and it allows potential adversaries like Putin to exploit those cracks and fissures. I think what we're seeing in places like Hungary and Poland, well, Poland not as much now, but to a certain extent, like this sort of backsliding on democratic values, which makes it difficult for the alliance to come to agreements on certain issues. I think we saw in light of the Belarusian hijacking of this plane earlier or late last year. I think it was the Turks, if I'm not mistaken, who sort of watered down the statement condemning Belarus for that action. And so it's small things like that I think are brought to the surface at times that show that allies disagree with each other on some of the fundamentals. But that's also what makes NATO strong when it needs to be. When you have 30 allies with different forms of government, with different leaders, with different threat perceptions, different priorities that can all come to a decision, then that solidarity and unity is extremely meaningful. I think when we look forward to the Madrid summit in June of this year, which is where NATO will unveil its new strategic concept, which is, this sort of guiding document for the alliance over the next 10 years, I think we'll see a focus on increased modes of consultation between NATO allies at the sub-NAC level. The NAC, of course, is the North Atlantic Council, which is the ambassadorial level at which all allies meet and make decisions. And so if you can try to hammer out bilateral issues that sometimes pop up between allies at a sub-NAC level and have more consultations between political advisors bilaterally, then we can present a more united front when it's really meaningful. For a perfect example, in the the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Right. Thank you, Rajan. We hear Putin saying now that really the war in Ukraine is really a war against NATO, including the United States. And I'm just wondering, what could be some of the repercussions for Putin at home if the war becomes more of a quagmire, or if the results fall short of what Putin would see as a victory?
First of all, I think we can all agree, and certainly President Putin probably sees by now, that a Russian military into which vast amounts of money were invested after the Russia-Georgia war, which showed up some of the weaknesses of the Russian military, and the raft of reforms that it underwent thereafter, have been of little consequence, because whether it's morale or logistical problems or supply shortfalls or conflicting command, they didn't have a commander in Ukraine overseeing the entire Ukrainian operation until recently. They just appointed one. And so it's been a bad showing. So I think the first thing will be to take stock of the failures and try to right the ship, it seems to me. On where Putin goes from here, I think the mood in Russia is at this point very militant and very ugly. They believe that just about everything but the kitchen sink has been thrown at them, that they don't have much to lose. When I say they, I'm talking about the political establishment, not the rank and file citizenry, whose opinion is neither here nor there in a state like Russia's. But I think that if the current phase of the operation in Donbass, which is essentially an attempt to do two things: to partition Ukraine by having off large parts of the east and south, and to reduce it to a landlocked country by locking up the littoral of the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. If that fails, and everybody seems to be optimistic that Russian firepower in the end will prevail, I'm not so sure. It will be a catastrophic defeat for Putin, because he won't be able to go home and say, well, I undertook this war, which has led to the death of something like 10,000 Russian soldiers, almost as many, by the way, as the Russians lost in a decade in Afghanistan. And who knows how many billions of rubles, and I'm coming home empty-handed. So this is make or break for him. The general that he's appointed to oversee operations in Ukraine is General Alexander Dvornikov. He has a checkered career, but his most recent assignment before becoming commander of the Southern Military District was to oversee operations in Syria. And his mantra there was relentless missile and airstrikes to break the will in the back of the enemy. So I think we're going to see this war scale up and get very, very ugly, because this is make or break for Putin.
Thank you. And then this next question will be for Jamie. Given your career with NATO, how important do you think Secretary General Jan Stoltenberg has been in managing the Ukrainian crisis, the NATO response to the Ukrainian crisis?
Yeah, well, the Secretary General is more of a secretary than a general. I mean that in a good sense, that obviously he is the consensus figure who has to keep the allies together and explain the common denominator, which is the policies that everybody can agree on. But of course, he's only as good, not just as his individual talent, because you need that, of course, communication skills and diplomacy, but you're only as good as the support that you get from the major allies. I think Stoltenberg has been effective in the Ukraine crisis in explaining exactly what NATO is doing, but also what it's not doing, because I think sometimes communication also is explaining your red lines clearly, particularly when it comes to avoiding the sort of ambiguity with somebody like Putin that could lead to misunderstandings and could lead to escalation. It's a thin line, as we were saying in this call, to tread, but I think Stoltenberg has trod it well. But of course, his job is massively easier when he's got the allies more or less, rowing the boat in the same direction, which I think, as my fellow panelists have said, has been largely true thus far in the Ukraine crisis. So, for example, I worked for Secretary Generals who, during the Balkan Wars in the 90s, where the United States was a total loggerheads with the Europeans on intervention in Bosnia. Both sides were slinging mud at each other, blaming them for the paralysis in NATO. And of course, in those circumstances, you could have a genius as Secretary General, but he or she can't do very much if the allies are not together. So yes, the Secretary General has a certain leadership role in convening, in organizing the meetings, the consultations, in pulling everybody together. But it's massively easier if the allies are willing to follow there. But the fact that Stoltenberg was recently confirmed in his post for a year when he was due to depart after the June summit that Rachel referred to go off to become the governor of the Norwegian Central Bank, that means that I think people have a very high degree of trust in him and feel that, in the middle of a crisis, this is not the time to sort of change the person who is steering the ship.
Great, thank you. And then there's another question which anyone could address is, what is the most essential role for Turkey in NATO? Is there any prospect of Turkey's departure from the alliance, especially since their bid to join the EU seems dead? Anyone interested in taking that one on?
I think the Turks make a big distinction between the EU, which they know they will not get into, although nobody will quite say the reason why, and we all know what the reasons are, and NATO, which they don't have to apply to get into. They've been a member of it since the 1950s. Incidentally, even when they were ruled by generals, NATO has had its share of undemocratic governments, and we have had our share of alliances with distinctly undemocratic governments. I don't think there's any reason for Turkey to exit NATO. It has shown its ability to push the envelope, including to the point of buying the Russian S-400 air defense system while being a NATO member. But I think what it would like to do in this war is to play the mediator, which it has done not with much success, but with a great deal of persistence. But it has no reason whatsoever, I think, to withdraw from NATO. It would be shooting itself in the head if it did that. Why would it do that?
Right. And Rachel?
Just really quickly, I don't have anything substantive to add, but for people in the audience that might not understand the inner workings of NATO, there's actually no mechanism within NATO to kick a country out. And I think that's important. I think that's important to note. And if a country decided to leave, the mechanism that they'd use to do that, they have to give notice to the United States. So that's just an interesting fact to note. There's no way to just kick a country out.
I agree. The NATO does not want Turkey to leave because a big player like Turkey outside the alliance, outside the Western camp, as a loose cannon, if I can use this expression, going its own way, is in nobody's interest, particularly as Turkey is central to what goes on in the Caucasus, what goes on in the Balkans, what goes on in the Eastern Mediterranean, Europe's future gas and energy relationships, as well as, of course, Syria and the Middle East. So better to have the the Turks inside the tent, even if it can be disruptive at times and outside. And I agree with Rajan's analysis entirely. The Turks know that their ability to stand up for themselves comes precisely because they have a leg in NATO. They're attractive to the Russians precisely because they are in NATO. I agree they play it very well, but the Turks are very careful. They don't pick fights with everybody on every issue all of the time. And remarkably, at a time when they had very difficult bilateral relations with the United States, particularly over the S-400s, they turned up punctiliously at every NATO exercise with their troops, contributed all of their ships to the NATO missions, and said, hand on their heart, that they were doing everything that NATO asked of them and were perfectly good allies. And of course, a lot of NATO infrastructure in terms of air bases, in terms of the land command for Eastern Europe, in terms of anti-ballistic missile defense sites are in Turkey as well. It's very valuable real estate. So it's a relationship that maybe can go further towards breaking point without breaking than many others in the alliance. And again, it comes to deft diplomacy. One of the things that I really, if I may very briefly, would credit Jens Stoltenberg with doing was Stoltenberg was brilliant at handling difficult allies. He was the only European leader that Donald Trump liked, as far as I could tell, who had Trump's confidence. He probably did Stoltenberg like going off to talk with burden sharing with Trump? Probably he didn't, but he did it because he felt that the most important thing was to keep NATO together and play the long game. Did he like going to see Mr. Erdogan every 5 minutes? Maybe he did, but he went because he also realized that the key thing was to keep those channels open. So it's a difficult job sometimes handling 30 unruly democracies, but the test of a good Secretary General is he doesn't, isolate people. He keeps the family together. He would love a united alliance. We all would, but it's not, basically realistic to think that that's going to happen. There is always an ally that at one stage would cause difficulties, but the key thing is to use the diplomacy to keep the community together.
Great, thank you.
And maybe with Marine Le Pen in a few days, the whole exercise could well start up again. Watch this space.
Yes, that would definitely change a lot of dynamics for sure. So now we have just 2 or 3 minutes left, and I wanted to end with one final question. We've been discussing NATO, its future, and so my question to each of you is: has NATO found its purpose for the 21st century, or do you think it's still looking? So I hate to put you first on the spot, Rachel, but what do you think?
Well, I think that if there's one thing that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has done is focus the alliance in a way that it has not been focused for years. And I think that's a good thing. I think in the aftermath of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, there was no question that the alliance would be trying to figure out what its role would be, both within the European continent and out of area operations. And I think that if there's one, there's nothing positive that has come out of this, but I do think that NATO has been focused and it has woken up Europe in a way that it needed to be woken up. The question now is if it can continue and how long this momentum lasts for. I also think there's a major question of how the alliance is going to approach China. There was a lot of discussions, I think, before the Russian invasion of this new strategic concept in being released in June, and talking about how the alliance would start to think about China. And, I have a really hard time thinking that NATO's most meaningful role is going to be in the Indo-Pacific region. And I understand why we have to talk about China's inroads to Europe and how NATO might respond to that. But I really do think that this is a time for NATO to go back to its roots and focus on Russia and allow the United States to focus more heavily on the Indo-Pacific region.
Great, thank you. Rajan?
If the conclusion drawn from the Ukraine war is that Russia is a big threat, then NATO has found its purpose. If the conclusion is that it's not merely the threat we thought it was, then it's a different story. But I expect the lesson to be drawn is that Russia is a substantial threat. But that doesn't solve the problem of how you deal with the Russian threat. What ought to be the internal allocation of resources? What should be the European share? Should it change in any substantial way? Should it go beyond burden sharing to something approaching strategic autonomy within NATO? And then there's a question of how do you deal with Russia after the war? because it is too great a country, and by great I mean large in size and a nuclear power, to be dealt with by just sending it out to the periphery. But what is the relationship with Russia in the years ahead? Are there common interests that we pursue, not because we want to do President Putin a favor, but because on strategic arms control or the revival of some version of the INF Treaty, which it was a shame, I think, to tear up? Do we have any dealings with Russia, or do we simply wait Putin out and say no dealings with Russia until he's around? That remains to be seen. I don't think there's complete identity within NATO on that.
Right. Thank you so much. And Jamie?
Well, again, many good points have been made. My sense is that, yes, obviously, the big shock of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the fact that Putin has turned Russia, whether we like it or not, into a more totalitarian state, at least for the time being, will mean that NATO will go back to its original purpose. But as I've said, there will be challenges that will test NATO along the way. I agree, we need a much greater role of the Europeans. The Europeans, at least from a financial point of view, seem willing to take that on. But in terms of strategic culture, in terms of organization, they need to show that they are able to do it effectively. The other thing, however, is that other challenges don't go away simply because Mr. Putin invades Ukraine. We have the problems of jihadism emerging now powerfully in many parts of Africa. 80% of terrorist attacks now occur in sub-Saharan Africa. We have the issue of climate change, which NATO has recently embraced. We have the whole issues of societal security, cyber attacks, hybrid warfare. We have militarization in space, in ballistic missiles, in new technologies proceeding apace. So I would hope that, rather like Lyndon Johnson, who said that a good politician should be able to walk, well, I think he said something else, and chew gum at the same time. I don't think that NATO can go back simply to being a one-issue organization like it was during the Cold War. What we've seen, final point, since the advent of the Ukraine conflict, is the United States and the Europeans working together really as a team, not just in NATO, also on the Trade and Technology Council between the EU and the US on a variety of different issues. And I would hope that even though NATO won't technically take on every security threat in the world, it has to have priorities. Nonetheless, the fact that you've got the 30 transatlantic democracies and all of their partners, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, who turned up at the last NATO foreign ministers meeting a couple of days ago, that this network, this diplomatic security network that NATO represents today, can be used also to keep an eye on climate change, on the Sahel, on the Middle East, on the militarization of space, on the future of the nuclear proliferation treaty, and a lot of these other issues, so that there will be two NATOs, if you like, an everyday NATO. Yes, it's all about Russia for the time being, but a larger sort of NATO, which would help to sort of coordinate that transatlantic security policy. So because we do now, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, Joanna, live in a world where 70% of the global population today live in autocracies. That number is going up every year. The number who live in democracies is going down. Russia and China are coming closer together, so dealing with them separately makes less and less sense. And we've got to sort of, keep that in mind and get NATO involved, I think, in that debate as well. Finally, I agree with Rajan. The Putin regime is not Russia any more than the Bolsheviks were Russia, or the Tsar was Russia, or any other Russian leader encapsulated the whole country. I think it's right that NATO should not cancel the NATO-Russia Founding Act or the NATO-Russia Council, keep them in suspension, and always keep the hand of cooperation open to a future Russia. Russia collapsed twice in the 20th century. The Putin regime hopefully will collapse sometime in the 21st century, and we'll go back to a new opportunity to build a better relationship with Russia. The previous ones, unfortunately, didn't work out, but as we say in London, third time lucky.
Great. Thank you so much. That's a great point to end this discussion. I want to thank our panelists so much for a very comprehensive, amazingly for 1 hour discussion, fascinating discussion. And over to you, Courtney.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you, Joanna, for moderating. Rajan, Rachel, Jamie, this was fantastic. I really appreciate it. Just a couple of notes. We have our next event is on Tuesday, April 26th, and we'll be digging into Russia's inner workings. So please do sign up for that one. That's virtual. We also have an in-person event for those who are in New York with Dr. Fiona Hale, and that's on Wednesday, May 4th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. So please do RSVP for that. If you're in New York, it's member only. And for those of you who are interested in the French elections, we did an event on this the other week and it is on our YouTube channel. So please do feel free to check that replay to figure out what is happening and what the predictions are. So thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to everyone who attended today. And we hope to see you next week. Thank you.